I'm sorry, sir. It's been declined." The words fell like a drop of black ink into a glass of clear water. No one screamed, no one gasped, but the air around them froze sharp and brittle like glass just before it shatters. The soft sizzle of truffle oil continued steady and indifferent, as if the kitchen were ignoring the slow-motion accident unfolding at the register. The scent of mushrooms browned butter and the golden glow of Edison lights from the high ceiling created a perfect stage where Veridian Burger Co. showcased its vision of flawlessness. Julian Croft stood beneath the warm light cast like artificial sunlight from above. He stared at the black card with golden edges lying on the counter, a small object yet unbearably heavy. Not just a credit card, not just a method of payment. It was a symbol. The founder's card, a master key to the empire he had built with his own hands, brick by brick, idea by idea. And now it had been declined, as if Veridian Burger Co. no longer recognized its own creator. Elena the cashier struggled to maintain her professional smile, but her trembling hand betrayed her. She slid the card back toward him like returning something tainted. Julian looked at her. Her eyes avoided his as if she couldn't meet the spotlight after a failed performance. Behind her stood Caleb, arms crossed posture like a pillar in a cathedral. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The quiet smirk in his eyes was enough to drown out every other sound. Julian didn't get angry. What he felt had no clear shape. It was emptiness wide and deep like a dried-up well where even the last drops of self-worth had long since vanished. He pulled a few crumpled dollar bills from his wallet, a small gesture, but each note felt like a confession. He quietly stepped into a shadowed corner where the lights dimmed and the stairs couldn't reach him. Veridian Burger Co. His brainchild still looked like a dream crafted by architects who worshipped reclaimed wood and polished steel. The space was warm and refined like a culinary gallery. The smell of toasted brioche mixed with oak wood and slow-brewed black coffee. Lo-fi jazz trickled from hidden ceiling speakers as steady as the heartbeat of a luxurious machine. But it was all a shell. Beneath the gloss, something was rotting. Julian could feel it. There was no laughter, no teasing behind the counter. Every footstep was cautious. Every conversation clipped, detached. A tray dropped. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. People flinched. No one turned to look. Caleb glanced sideways just enough to make the young man who dropped it freeze in place. No yelling, no threats. Here, fear had no voice. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. Memories came the early days of Veridian when the restaurant pulsed with laughter, shouted orders, and joyful footsteps. Now it felt like an abandoned cathedral where faith had been replaced by fear. Elena walked to a nearby table handing over a tray with a flawless smile, the kind you learn to survive with, but Julian saw it. The moment the guest turned away just for a heartbeat, the smile cracked. Weariness peeked through only to be masked again as if it had never existed. Julian unfolded the receipt. He didn't look at the total. His eyes stopped at the small line printed at the bottom, Shift Lead C Thorne. The name Thorne, not Caleb. And clearly not Elena, the one who was actually running everything from counter to floor. Paper doesn't lie, but it can be silenced. Systems don't fail by accident. Someone had bent it. Someone was manipulating the data. Someone was scrubbing away evidence like blood from a blade. Julian folded the receipt. Neat. Precise. His eyes narrowed, not because of his vision, but because of an old ache surfacing dull and steady like an echo from a sin that had never been forgiven. 5 years ago, he ignored the signs. A close friend sent a silent cry for help through numbers. And Julian too, busy too, blind too, afraid, stayed silent. The cost: bankruptcy, a lost home, a broken family, and eventually death, though the paperwork called it a stroke. Never again. No one else would be crushed in the name of efficiency. Not in the house he once dreamed would be the last kind one standing in a ruthless New York. He whispered voice light as the last breath of a blood oath, not again. Not on my watch. And the air seemingly still began to carry a scent. The scent of secrets. The scent of betrayal. The scent of a hunt that had just begun in silence. The next morning, Julian returned to Veridian Burger Co. But this time he brought no card. No suit, no watch, no name. Just a gray baseball cap and a worn hoodie. He looked no different than the freelance students hunched over laptops at the Starbucks next door. He sat by the wall, set down a cup of coffee untouched, and opened his phone. The camera had been activated, but the screen only showed a news app. For 4 straight hours, Julian did nothing but observe. Every movement was encoded in his mind as a stream of data. Every 10 minutes, Elena had to bend down and double-check the orders printed from the POS. The gap between her first smile and the next stretched nearly 40 minutes. Caleb made his rounds behind the counter, never touching anyone, never speaking. Yet every staff member instantly adjusted their posture, like fish scattering from the shadow of a shark. No shouting, no threats, just glances and a silence thick as concrete. A young man named Leo Julian picked up the name from Elena's introduction, was wiping tables. Young, bright-eyed, barely 2 days into the job. He wiped with clumsy eagerness, still carrying the naive charm of someone who hadn't yet learned how to be afraid. Caleb approached, hands in his pockets, his tone light like a teacher quizzing a student. Leo. Yes, freezer needs cleaning. Leo frowned, but I thought I was on register training today. Caleb smiled a smile cold enough to freeze the water in a glass. You thought wrong. Leo looked to Elena as if hoping for some confirmation or explanation. She said nothing, just clenched her hands and turned away. Leo lowered his head and walked toward the cold steel door at the back of the kitchen. Julian didn't take his eyes off the scene. He made a note, punished for asking. No reason required. Later, near the soda fountain, Julian accidentally bumped into Leo. The boy had just come back from the freezer, lips, pale hands shaking from the cold. Julian placed a lid on his cup and asked quietly, "Tough first week." Leo gave a faint smile. They call it a character test. He paused, but it feels more like they're trying to see who breaks first. Julian was about to say more when another staff member passed by. She didn't stop, didn't make eye contact. She just spoke softly, barely louder than the lo-fi music playing overhead. The cameras in the back don't record audio. Footage wipes every 48 hours. Be careful who you talk to. A chill ran down his spine. But Julian didn't lift his head, didn't react. He simply nodded a nod, encoded so subtly no one could trace it. The only person in the restaurant who moved with unwavering rhythm was Marcus. He stood at the hot line like a fortress, calm, precise, silent. No shouting, no flexing, just perfect timing on the pans, perfect angles on the cuts. When Caleb walked by, every other staff member stiffened and adjusted their stance. Marcus didn't. He didn't flinch, didn't look up. Just kept slicing onions as if he were cutting through time itself. Julian saw that. And he understood if he needed an ally, that head chef was the last man left unbroken. Near the end of the day, when the crowd had thinned, Julian stood close to the kitchen, picking a spot that didn't obstruct traffic, but let him hear the blade against the board. Marcus didn't look at him, but he knew someone was standing there. You run a tight kitchen, Julian said. Marcus nodded, a nod not of courtesy but of truth. Julian lowered his voice. I'm reviewing the numbers. Something doesn't add up. Marcus paused with the knife. Not stopped, just slowed like a soldier stepping half back to hear the click of a chamber being loaded. Then he looked straight at Julian, a gaze that held no fear, no friendliness, just the layered fatigue of a man who had survived being starved too many times. The numbers in the till don't add up either, Marcus said quietly, especially Fridays, after close. Julian held his breath. This wasn't a suspicion anymore. This was testimony. Why haven't you said anything? Marcus turned back to his knife, speaking flatly, as if recounting a ghost story in an old Georgia kitchen. This job is the only thing keeping me out of prison, son. I learned a long time ago, don't see what you're not allowed to see. That warning, neither bitter nor broken, was more terrifying than any sentence. It was a frozen truth hardened through seasons of fracture. Julian didn't leave the restaurant with a clue. He left with a map. Every shadow now had coordinates. Every crack had a name. And if this system was bleeding, Caleb wasn't the first one who needed to be cut open. Julian didn't head straight back to the hotel. He wandered through the streets of Lower Manhattan like a ghost who knew every turn. Every intersection had once been a landmark on the path to building the Veridian Empire. But now those bricks only reminded him of the one thing he had always avoided: the price of silence. He stopped in front of an empty convenience store, where the flickering fluorescent light reflected on the glass like a distorted moon. He stood there for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. No calls, no recordings, just photos. The first image that came up was of David M., co-founder, deceased 2020. The cause of death was listed as stroke from prolonged stress. Julian knew better than anyone that death came from sleepless nights, from the terror of being investigated for financial discrepancies, ones David hadn't caused, but Julian had seen and allowed to happen. Not again. The next morning he returned to Veridian, but this time he didn't sit in the shadows. He waited for Elena during her breakout back behind the restaurant, a small concrete yard bordered by a rusted fence and a graffiti mural of a burger with wings. She appeared holding a cup of water, her eyes carrying the same weary tension as on her first day, anxious, exhausted, and trained to hide it. Julian didn't begin with a question. I once had a friend, he said. We opened our first restaurant together. One day I saw the system flag an error, money missing. I guessed who did it. But I said nothing, told myself it was internal, not my place. He paused, his voice slowing as if it might break. He lost everything, his family, his name, then his life. Elena said nothing, but the way her hand gripped the cup as if trying to snap it in half told Julian she understood. I don't know everything happening here, he said, locking eyes with her. But I know one thing: I won't stay silent again. And I can't do this alone. A moment passed. Then her eyes widened. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, like someone had touched a string that had been pulled too tight for too long. And it snapped. Silently, tears began to fall down her cheeks. No sobbing, no sound. Just the quiet release of something buried far too deep. Every week she whispered, my paycheck is short, always by 87 or 50, not enough to sue, but enough to make me choose between my son's asthma meds or the power bill. She pulled out her phone, opened a folder, handed it to Julian. Inside were screenshots of pay stubs, threatening texts from Caleb urging her to stay quiet for the good of the team. A short video shot discreetly with her rear camera showed Caleb standing close to another employee, whispering something, and the worker breaking down in tears. I kept everything, she said, just hoping. One day someone would believe me. Julian didn't say thank you. He didn't pat her shoulder. He just nodded. Slowly, firmly. I believe you. And now, everyone else will too. That night in his hotel room, Julian opened his laptop. Logged into Veridian's internal security system, using old credentials he was sure had been deactivated. Strangely, they still worked. No one had expected him to come back. He didn't search for Caleb's name. He searched keywords like manual adjustment cache variance and payroll override. He filtered 3 years of data, all branches sorted by frequency, and then one name repeated itself in the approved by column A. Sterling. Arthur Sterling. An old friend? Financial advisor? Executive vice president? The man who once clapped Julian on the shoulder and said, "Julian, you build dreams. I build empires. They're not the same thing." Julian sat in silence, the screen casting a cold glow across his face, like a ghostly reflection of himself. This wasn't a single man's wrongdoing anymore. This was a structure, a network, a system of exploitation designed and operated like a silent machine, and Arthur was the one pressing the buttons. It was nearly 2 a.m. Julian sat by the hotel window. Below New York glowed like a stage without a curtain call. He picked up his phone, opened the recorder. This is Julian Croft. If you're hearing this, it means Arthur Sterling has succeeded in silencing me. All the evidence is on the hard drive, already sent to my attorney. If I disappear, release it. He paused, then looked to his left. A small black USB drive lay on the table. Julian needed more people, and he knew exactly who. The old soldier. The man who stayed silent not from weakness but from the debt he owed to life. The next morning, Julian found Marcus at the end of the morning shift. The chef was wiping his blade with a cloth, an unnecessary step, but one Marcus always took. Julian rested a hand on the steel counter. "I know your past. I know you don't want trouble. But Arthur Sterling is behind all of this. And if we don't stand up, he'll crush us one by one." Marcus didn't lift his head right away. But when he did, his eyes, bloodshot from exhaustion, heavy with time, flashed with something old and quietly defiant, the belief that there was still something worth standing for. "The security system," he said softly. "There's a back door. The IT guy who set it up owes me one. I can get you 6 months of footage untouched." Julian didn't smile, but something shifted in his chest. Marcus's silence hadn't been surrender. It had been waiting. And that wait was over. The Sterling Capitol building towered over Park Avenue like a blade pointed at the sky. No signage in the lobby, no names on the glass doors, only cold granite walls and a front desk staff silent as a fortress. Julian walked in, wearing a worn-out coat, no badge, no appointment, yet the elevator doors still opened. The system remembered him, even if the people within it did not. 42nd floor. Glossy walnut floors, Italian leather chairs, abstract art scattered like coded symbols. Arthur Sterling's office stood at the end of the hallway, a block of glass suspended over the city like a throne floating above Manhattan. Arthur was already waiting behind his desk, as if Julian had been formally invited. Pale gray suit, eyes uncreased by time, emotionless, but sharp like the glint of a scalpel. "Julian," he said, voice calm, as if welcoming a brother just back from Florence. "To what do I owe the pleasure, tired of retirement?" Julian didn't shake his hand, didn't greet him. He placed an iPad on the dark wood desk and swiped. Data surfaced like cracks on safety glass. 7 branches, Julian said. 20% discrepancy between reported cash earnings and deposits. Over $2 million unaccounted for. All manually approved. All by you. Arthur glanced at the screen. No reaction. No panic. Just a slight smirk, subtle enough to avoid being called arrogant. Aggressive cost management, Julian. A necessary evil. You wouldn't understand. You always led with heart. Julian tapped again. The screen shifted to video Caleb opening the cash drawer, slipping thick bills into his apron pocket. Another clip. Caleb looming over a young employee in the back hallway saying something inaudible, but the boy's terrified face spoke louder than words. Julian stared him down. And I suppose this is human resource management. Arthur's smile vanished like a ghost stripped of its mask. For a split second, his face hardened like plaster. Julian, he said, his voice shifting, no longer a former friend, but a hardened CEO fluent in the language of war. You have no idea what you're meddling with. This is bigger than you. Bigger than your pathetic little crusade. Julian stood firm. I'm taking this to the board. And the press. Arthur let out a quiet laugh, then stepped around the desk like a diplomat about to conclude a hearing. He stopped inches from Julian, close enough for his voice to turn venomous breath. Do it! And I will not only destroy you, I will erase you. I will dismantle everything you've ever built. I'll start with your little friends at the restaurant. Elena. The single mother, right? It would be a shame if CPS heard some troubling rumors about her son's home environment. Julian's breathing grew heavier, not from fear, from rage, but he didn't flinch. He looked Arthur in the eye as if staring into a dry well, its bottom lined with bone. And then a small, abrupt vibration. Both phones, Arthur's and Julian's, lit up at once. Arthur glanced at his screen. His finger froze. Julian simply nodded like a long-awaited alarm had gone off. On the phone screen, New York Times, the silent menu, inside the culture of fear and wage theft at Veridian Burger Co. Beneath the headline, a covert photo. Elena sitting behind the restaurant, wiping tears with her sleeve. Not sobbing, not looking at the camera. But her eyes, exhausted, exposed, were proof enough of the quiet violence Arthur's system had built. Arthur stared at the screen as if seeing his own face in a coffin. He clenched the phone, his eyes reddening. But Julian remained calm. It's over, Arthur. Arthur didn't reply. He just stood there, fist tightening as if preparing to strike, but Julian had already turned away. He walked out of the office needing no victory speech, no raised voice, because this time the truth wasn't locked behind doors. It had been released through the article, the witnesses, the data, and the voices that had once been silent. 30 minutes later, Julian got the news Veridian's internal compliance board had convened an emergency meeting. Arthur Sterling was suspended pending investigation. Caleb Thorne vanished from the HR system not as a resignation, but as a revoked clearance before formal summons. At the Veridian Soho branch, where it all began, Elena was leading the afternoon cleanup like any other day, but for the first time in months, laughter returned. Not much, not loud, but real. At the back of the kitchen, Marcus quietly examined the shift schedule. On the printed sheet for the night crew, a new line had been handwritten. Security Review Marcus L. Authorized access granted. He looked at that line as if reading a rewritten oath of honor. Within 7 days, what began as a leaked story in a quiet corner of the New York Times exploded into a national reckoning. Harmless-looking images, Elena's silent tears, Leo's terrified eyes, the buried footage recovered by Marcus became nails driven into the coffin of the company's long-polished hypocrisy. Veridian Burger Co.'s stock plummeted without breaks. Investors fled. Dozens of branches were surrounded by protests not from strangers, but from the very employees who had once bowed under the system. Now they stood tall, holding signs that read, "We served burgers. You served silence." Arthur Sterling was arrested at his Hamptons estate, still wearing premium athletic gear and the arrogance he didn't have time to remove. Caleb was caught at JFK Airport with a passport in his pocket and a one-way ticket to Dubai. Both faced multiple federal charges: wage theft, employee intimidation, money laundering, and financial fraud. Julian didn't hold a press conference. No podium, no spotlights. He posted a video shot on his phone, raw, simple, unedited, filmed inside the kitchen of the Veridian Soho branch during a lunch break. He wore an old apron, grease stains still fresh. The lighting was imperfect, but his eyes had never been clearer. "I built this company on a promise of ethics and quality. But I let that promise die not by action but by silence. I have no excuse, no speech to redeem it. I only have one thing from this moment on. My only job is to listen. No music, no stirring message. Just honesty, the one thing Veridian had lacked for far too long." The following week, Julian established an independent employee advisory council, a body not under the control of any branch. Elena was invited to be a founding member. She initially declined, afraid she wasn't qualified. But Julian told her, "You don't need an MBA to know what fairness looks like." Marcus was appointed regional operations director, not just for his integrity, but for having mastered the rarest skill, knowing when to stay silent and when to speak up. Together, they rewrote the internal training program. A new mandatory course was added, Leading with Empathy, taught by Elena herself, not through PowerPoint, but through lived experience. Every new Veridian employee would hear her story not as legend, but as a reminder: never believe silence is neutral. In a toxic system, silence is a form of violence. 3 months later. A quiet Friday afternoon. Julian was wiping down tables in the main dining area alongside a group of new interns. No office Zoom calls, no crisis management. He was teaching them how to check for leftover fingerprints on metal trays, how to fold napkins properly, small things, but the starting point of respect. The boy next to him, Samuel, was 17, fresh out of high school. "Are you the manager?" he asked. Julian smiled. "Not today." He pointed at his apron. "Today, I'm just the guy who wipes the tables." Across the room, Elena, now the official manager of the Soho branch, was reviewing end-of-day orders. She looked over at Julian and smiled. Not forced, not tired. A smile with wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, proof that something had come back to life. Marcus passed by, placing a tray of new test burgers on the kitchen counter. He said nothing, just nodded at Julian. That nod wasn't a greeting. It was a signal that things were on the right path. As the restaurant closed for the night, Julian pulled something from his wallet. The founder's card. No longer absolute power. No longer the master key to an empire. He placed it on the counter beside a jar of dried flowers. Not for display, but as a reminder, what defines a system isn't a card or shares or hierarchy. It's how people treat each other when no one is watching. He stepped out of the restaurant, his hand resting gently on Samuel's shoulder, like a father guiding a child across a busy street. Behind him, the lights of Veridian no longer glowed with artificial gold. They had become something softer, like a promise rewritten the right way. Sometimes the most toxic part of a system isn't the shouting, it's the silence that lasts too long. One voice may be broken, but when many stand together, the truth can't be buried forever. Leadership isn't about being heard. It's about making sure others have the right to speak. What did you feel after this story? If you've ever witnessed injustice or seen someone pushed into the dark because others chose silence, share your story. And if you believe courage begins with one simple voice, like, comment, share, and subscribe to Toch Story, so you won't miss the stories of bravery and heart that need to be told.